Greetings and welcome to God's Unchanging Word and this week's edition of News, Nuggets, and Insights. Today is Friday, December 23rd, and we are rapidly racing to the end of this calendar year. I want to begin our program today with something that's on the minds of a lot of people, and it should be alarming to the rest of the world as well. It is the continued increase in the rise in terrorism. On Monday of this week, December 19th, the news broke first with an attack in Turkey. This time the attack was against the Russian ambassador, Andrei Karlov. He was actually delivering a lecture in front of a live audience in a speech gallery when a gunman approached him from behind, point blank, pulled a gun and shot him in front of all of those witnesses in that audience. Later, it was found out that he was actually a police officer for the Turkish government his job is to protect the citizens. Sometime later, there are sources now who have been reporting that Turkey is blaming this on the CIA, saying it is our fault that the United States is involved with this. Somehow, we don't know how. On the same day, just a few hours later in Germany, they had another terrorist attack where a terrorist drove a truck into a very busy audience of people inside a Christmas mall while they were out shopping. This time, at least 12 people are dead and 50 people are wounded. And as that goes on, now Europe is bracing itself for more attacks as ISIS continues to call for more people to do the exact same thing. We need to be aware of this in the United States, because they are asking for the terrorists to get trucks in America and do the exact same thing over here. And this has been a source of contention in the United States, but if we don't protect the borders and protect the immigrants that's coming in from being vetted properly, we are going to see more and more of these attacks even here in the United States. So I just wanted to bring that out because this is a problem that's not going to go away. It's something that's going to continue to increase over the years, and we need to be aware of these things as we go forward. Now, the program tonight is dealing with the U.S. debt. Over the last 2 weeks, we began to introduce to the audience the U.S. debt clock. So 2 weeks ago, on December 9th, if you hadn't seen that News, Nuggets, and Insights, you can go to God's Unchanging Word, and there's an archives. Just click on that archives, and it will take you to all the past News, Nuggets, and Insights week by week, and you can begin to follow the debt on what we're talking about. So we introduced this debt clock in case you've never seen it. And if you have internet, you can actually go to Google, type in U.S. debt clock, just click on that. It'll have a real-time clock comes up, and it will have numbers just flashing all through this. So what I began to do a couple weeks ago is I wanted to introduce people to this, and in particular to how to read what's going on. So what we did is we began to focus on one small section of that debt clock of what I had here. And so let me bring in just a review here, and I'm going to talk about this today. We introduced about the debt that we're in and why it's going to be almost impossible to get out of it because we haven't followed the principles of God's law. Then last week, we brought in Ronald Reagan, who actually showed how we can make some headway into breaking down the problems that were created in the 60s of the welfare programs. They're trying to get people back to work. But we also showed how the debt rose, the people didn't turn back from God, and we continued the slippery slope to where we're going today. So I'm going to pick up that story today and follow up one more time. So let me go back into this. In the middle of this chart down in the bottom here, we show Medicare enrollees at 56 million people and Medicaid recipients at 73 million people. Now, the 73 million are people who are not working or they're below the retirement age that are receiving the government benefits or help for their medical expenses. Whereas the Medicare are people who are retired who have actually put aside the money and have paying for their medical as they go. All right, so most of that money has been reserved and is paid for by the taxpayer themselves, whereas Medicaid is being paid by taxpayers at large by the distribution of funds to them. The next thing I brought out was this, is that nearly half of all Americans are receiving government welfare of some type. All right, some type. So 43 million people are receiving food stamps. All right, so that's coming from taxpayers. That are people who are either underpaid or they don't work at all. Now, let me clarify something here, because I don't want this to seem like we're just going after people who are just not working. There are some people who legitimately cannot, who are legitimate welfare recipients that need the help. They have physical conditions. But when you look at the numbers and you look at the condition of America, you got to come to the conclusion that this many people can't be in that condition legitimately. So there's something definitely going on here. A total of 162 million people in America, nearly half of America now, has reached the point that it is on the government rolls of being supported. All right, so now we're reaching that tipping point. The tipping point is that when more people are receiving government aid than not, then you begin to draw away from any potential growth, any way we can grow at all down the road. So that's what we're talking about today. Now, the last thing I wanted to show you here is that in the environment that we're living in, where the government has been telling us how well everybody's doing, 42 million, 42.9 million, almost 43 million people are living in poverty. All right, almost 43 million people are living in poverty. So that's got to be telling us something. And in addition, even with Obamacare, and supposedly is going to have everyone have insurance. Well, look what's happened since Obamacare now for the last, how many years it's been going? 31 million people still don't have insurance. And the price for insurance is out of sight. No end in sight. And so it wasn't working. And so at this particular time, something's going to be done. What? I don't know. And it's going to be one of the most difficult undertakings in America, and for us to be able to go forward. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on with why the United States is in the problem that it's into. How do we get this way? How in the world did it get to this stage that over half of America is on government support of some particular time? Now, we broke down last 2 weeks talking about in Deuteronomy, God says that if you don't do what God says, you will receive the wages or the curses of your actions. People today don't believe that. They don't believe that there's a cause and effect for what is done. And even when people try to do things, they try to do them their own way. Now, we can look back. There's a time in history in the nation of Israel when God had brought the children out of Israel, that people did what was right in their own eyes. So we can look back now and we can see a history of what happens when you do things your own way. Even when you're trying to do what's right and you don't do it God's way, things don't work out well. It's found in the book of Judges. This is when there was no king in Israel. This is when there was basically no prophet in Israel. God's word was hard to be found at the time. And so there's two verses I'm going to bring out, and they're both in Judges, Judges 17, verse 6, and Judges 21, verse 25. And basically they both say the same thing. It says, "And in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And the very last verse of the book of Judges says the exact same thing. The final verse of the final chapter, and says, "And everyone did what was right in his own eyes." The book of Judges describes a period of time that covers approximately 350 years from the death of Joshua to the rise of the monarchy under Samuel. Unlike Joshua, however, which we recounted a period of history largely marked the faithfulness to God under Joshua, Judges recounts a period of history characterized as the most part of unfaithfulness. So when you look at the book of Judges, what God has showed us is like a balance. All right? When things were done the way God says to do, the nation of Israel was blessed. But when Joshua died, it says the generation that came up after Joshua, it says, did not know God. So what am I talking about today? I'm talking about a period of time in America that we have moved into like the book of Judges, where we have removed God from our way of life, from our decision making, of the way we look forward to doing things in the future, and to doing them our own way, just like in the book of Judges. Now, what I want to play for you now is a little clip from the Constitutional Christian, from the interview that we had with Governor Huckabee, that talks about a period of time where people tried to do what was right, but even when they did, because they did it in their own way, it still failed to resolve the problems that the nation was in. So if we're ready, let's play this little video. It's just about 3.5 minutes long.
Now, what happened between the time of the Johnson and in 1973, several things. On the one hand, there was a new activist revolution of culture. We saw a no-fault divorce, which means that it became easier to get a divorce than it did to get out of a contract for buying a used car. That's actually the case in my home state of Arkansas. You could get out of a marriage more easily than you could get out of having purchased a used car. It started in California. It was a terrible law. By the way, Ronald Reagan was the governor who helped bring in no-fault divorce. Again, unintended consequences. It sounded like a good idea at the time. Disastrous consequences, because it meant that it was easier and easier to get out of a marriage and break up a home. In the other part, we began to create social welfare programs. Lyndon Johnson, largely responsible under the Great Society, sounded great, making sure that we were going to attack poverty. But in attacking poverty, what we did, we began to actually finance broken homes, broken marriages, and paying women who were single for raising of children. But if she were married, she didn't get the benefits. Now, the practical effect of that was we created a society that went from a very small number of children being raised in single-parent homes without both a mother and a father, to a point where now more than half of the children growing up in America are growing up in single-parent homes. They don't have both mothers and fathers. There's a huge financial impact of that. There's a huge sociological impact of that, the likes of which we have yet to even fully comprehend, because we're still seeing the reaping of that. We had the time of open sex, free drugs, the hallucination generation. We had the disillusionment with Vietnam and the war. America lost its first war because we went through this period of saying God is dead. We had the Supreme Court decisions that said we can't pray in school, we can't read the Bible in school. Again, that was a direct violation of the First Amendment. It also was a time when the courts created a law that they had no authority to create. They were manufacturing law, they were legislating. And because of the silence of the other two branches of government, those rulings stood when they should not have stood. The Supreme Court had no authority to make those decisions. So coincidental to the time when these things were happening, Supreme Court decisions, cultural changes, what was also happening? Pulpits were being silenced.
So there was nobody, like we read the scripture, there was the wise men, they were silent.
They were being told to shut up and not say anything.
And the prudent who had the wisdom to look down the road, they were removed.
It's like turning the light off in the lighthouse and letting the ships crash onto the rocks because somebody told them the light might be offensive. It's like telling the security guards not to announce the coming of the intruder. And so while the churches and the pulpits were being silenced, the very things that they normally would have been crying out against were taking place.
That stage again, this time's more critical than ever, is that if the pulpits remain silent about the conditions in America today, and if we don't speak up about the issues and go to the source and to the roots, we're never going to eliminate the problem that we are in. Throwing money, as we have just seen, nearly $10 trillion at the problem without fixing the source will not resolve our problems. What we need today, more than ever before, is God's people speaking up. The environment in America is changing, and it's changing rapidly. It appears that God has quenched, at least in part, the opportunity for the evil to suppress God's people, to give us the opportunity right now to join together and speak up against the evils of this nation if we're ever going to return to God. So we need to do that. So what are some of the consequences of these broken principles? The very first one, whether people realize it or not, is not working. Today there are almost 93 million Americans in this nation who are not working. Almost 93 million. And while we're told that the unemployment is at the lowest level in years, the truth is the people are not working and they need to go to work. So what happens when we break down this very first principle? And by the way, this is a biblical principle. Look what it says here. This is in verse 10 of Corinthians. It says, "For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now, those who are such we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ that they work in quietness and eat their own bread." Can you imagine today if we took 162 million people, got them off of the rolls of any kind of government support and said, listen, you're on your own, go find a job and go get something to eat? What do you think would happen in this nation? We would see riots and burnings and lootings like we have never seen in modern times. And it's because we've broken down this very basic principle here of not working. And we rewarded people not to work, as was mentioned by Governor Huckabee in that special. And by the way, that special is going to be out next month. And I encourage everyone to look forward, to write in and get you a copy when it's out. It's loaded with information just like he shared with you today. But we literally, from the times of the 60s, we paid the women to stay home, not work, and raise kids. And so what would happen, they realized that the more kids they had, the more money they got. And so we saw broken homes with lots of children and being brought up without a father figure in the home, and we've seen it escalate worse and worse from generation to generation. So what happens when you don't work? Look at some of this. By the way, let me bring these 2 points out. Not working at all, so that means if you can work some, and busybodies. You realize the people who don't work, they don't have anything to do, so what do? They get in other people's business. So I looked at the word busybody, and basically it comes from the Greek word which means an authority or a ruler over someone else. And so we have people in America today who don't work, who think they know what's going on, and they try to tell other people how to run their lives while they themselves can't even support themselves. The primary byproduct of this is the breakdown in the family unit. So we have broken homes, a rise in immorality, increase in poverty, and increase in crime. And it gets worse and worse as we go. There's another byproduct, this. It becomes a generational curse, locking people into the welfare state from generation to generation. I want to tell you a story. I was in an apartment complex, and I was doing some cleaning for the company that I have. And while I was in there were 3 generations of welfare people. 3 generations, mind that. And the second generation is talking to her daughter who has a child, and the government agency is telling her that she needs to pay for the support for that child who was sick. Not imagine and say, what do you mean? And this is true. It says, what do you mean that I have to pay for my baby's welfare? I've never paid for anything in my life. I was shocked. I never paid for anything in my life. And so what we have is what I term as a generational curse, who locks people in a welfare state. And as the welfare state grows, it accelerates, and it must be continually supported as a cancer that eventually eats away all of those that feed it. Now, that reminded me of a comment by Margaret Thatcher of England. And she said this: "The problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money." And basically, that is where we are today in America. We're running out of other people's money because we're growing and growing with $20 trillion in debt. That's government debt. Individual debt and future debt of America is well over $120 trillion on the books that someone's going to pay for down the road somewhere. Now, I don't know any other way we're going to get out of this except turn back to God to begin to get blessings. And unless something happens soon, I don't see that happening. However, there is a resurgence right now of people who are willing to speak out and boldly go where no man has ever gone before. And I'm laughing because that's in an intro in one of the specials of a series that we run that I invite you to go online to see. It's called Today If You Hear His Voice. And if you get the introduction, we talk about that boldly going where no man has ever gone before. Because you see, the environment today is changing. And it's like God is opening the door for God's people to speak up and call what is right, right, and what's wrong, wrong, and reverse the way things have been going for the last 50 years. New on the website this week, we have Millennial Pioneers that if you go there is actually just mailed out this past week. So if you go to the website, you can click on that, and we should have it ready this week where you can actually watch the Millennial Pioneers that I was just speaking about, where we talk about going boldly where no man has gone before. Before we close today, I want to share something with you. I'd like to close our program today with something a little more inspirational. This is from the Vault, and this was brought up about 10 years ago. It's a little video that runs about 3.5 to 4 minutes. It's called The Power of Success. So take a moment, sit back, relax, watch this video, and I'll be back to say goodbye in just a moment. Well, we hope when this program settles in today, at the end of the day, we hope that our program's made a little bit of difference for you also. Next week, we're going to be introducing the intro for the new Constitutional Christian special that will be out next week. We'll talk about the year ahead, the events of the week, and until then, God bless everyone, and we'll see you next week on God's Unchanging Word, News, Nuggets, and Insights. God bless you.